I'd like to begin this morning by just offering a word or two about the golden years. You ever hear that phrase people talk about when we get a little older? Typically in America, they actually have sort of a definition of it. It's usually about the time you hit 65 or so. A lot of people either are retired or are thinking about retirement. And so the term is something precious. Gold is precious, so we look forward. We can sort of slow down, enjoy life a little more. And I didn't even realize that phrase was coined back in the 1950s. So it really isn't all that old as far as some of the other expressions that we use. And it was a marketing firm used it to promote a assisted living facility, actually. They talked about their golden years, so come to whatever, name of facility it was. However, the shame is not everyone lives to their golden years. So some people, as they age and mature and get a little wiser, actually realize that maybe our golden years they're really the years when we're a little younger, a little more vibrant, and they have a little more energy. I don't think any, us debating it is going to change the way that we use this phrase for sure, but I just mention it because as Abraham and Sarah got older, they were entering the equivalent of their golden years. I mean, Abraham wasn't even called by God until he was in our modern day golden years. He was 75, so we have to adjust it a little bit. But finally getting the son that God promised in Isaac, that was a big deal. And we'll look at the birth of Isaac briefly and then move on to the next chapter also. But Abraham and Sarah, they were at a point in their life, it was like God has already fulfilled his promise. We can just put it in cruise control and we'll just enjoy the rest of our life. God said, not so fast. And so that's what we'll see this morning. I'd like to look again at a little bit of two different chapters here, just 8 verses in Genesis 21 that tells us about the birth of the promised son, and then flip over to the next chapter where we see a very significant story about how God talked to Abraham again. So beginning in Genesis 21, just going from verse 1 through 7, it says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son. Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me.' And she added, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.'" As we move over to chapter 22, remember Abraham, he is 100, and Sarah bore that child when she was 90, since there was a 10-year difference. And so I'd like to read in Genesis 22 now, verses 1 through 19. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. I don't know about you, but when I read that, a lot of thoughts and emotions come to mind. I don't get chills, honestly, but I also am perplexed too, because there's a certain amount of knowledge of God we're never going to know, but we do know enough to understand generally. We can look at Abraham here and we can just imagine the agony that he was going through. And this is something God commanded him to do. That's where we really get confused. Like, why would God do this? Why would he tell him to sacrifice his son? This is what doesn't make sense. Abraham's 75 years old. God calls him and he says, you'll have descendants. 25 years later, he finally has that promised son. That's one thing I want to clarify first. When God says, take your only son, some might say, well, hey, Bible's wrong here. Abraham had a second son. It was Ishmael first. Well, the whole context God is speaking is take your only son that qualifies under the covenant, because this is the promised son. So clarify that. And Abraham knows that too. He knows that God promised that that the lineage would go through Isaac. And yet God one day says, Abraham, I want you to kill your son. Make him and sacrifice him to me. I don't, what would any of us do, honestly? And think of the agony. But what we see here is that Abraham doesn't question it. Doesn't mean he's not emotional about it. He's not trying to figure things out in his mind. So just, if you try to put yourself in Abraham's shoes here, a couple things here, some details we read. Well, first of all, it says the next morning he got up. Do you think Abraham got any sleep that night, by the way? God told me to sacrifice my son to him. I'll do that tomorrow. Okay. So that's one thing. Then it says he saddles his donkey. I don't know how long it takes to saddle a donkey, but you make sure it's secure and all. You think Abraham's thinking about what we're going to have for dinner that night? No, he's thinking, I'm doing this because I'm going to give my son up, the son that I love, to God. And then it says he chopped wood. Growing up, for part of my childhood, we had a wood burning stove. And so I'm no stranger to chopping wood. I'm glad I don't have to do it anymore, having central air now. But that's hard work, and it's time consuming. And so, you chop it, and then the piece falls, and you put it back up, and then you chop that half, and all that kind of, learn how to do all that stuff. With every swing of the axe, Abraham's thinking, the only reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to give my son back to God. And it's not like it was right down the road, or if God said, hey, Abraham, or Isaac is in his room right now, go and do it right now. It's not what it is. He had to take Isaac on a 3-day journey. So again, night and day. He's thinking the reason why we're on this trip is to give my son that I love back to God. Day 2, night and day. Thinking about the same thing the 3rd day, night and day. Think about a person's mental health for one thing. It's only in recent years we really start talking a lot more about mental health of people, but there's a lot of situations in the Bible where God's people suffered from mental health issues. And this was certainly a time for Abraham. He would have suffered. Elijah suffered. David suffered. And the list goes on and on. And Abraham also knows what God is asking him to do. God's very specific in his words. Again, we already talked about take your son, your only son. He also says, whom you love. So God knows what he's asking of Abraham here. I know you love your son more than anything, but I still want you to give him to me. And he says, go to the land of Moriah, offer him as a burnt offering. Well, we don't do burnt offerings anymore, but a burnt offering is what it sounds like. You burn it down to the ashes. So think about that for a moment. Abraham, if it's me, I'm thinking, what's a loophole here? How can I sort of satisfy God, but also get what I want and maintain my son? There's no way to do it here, because if he goes through with this, Isaac will be burnt to ashes. And I can't, he's not going to be alive, honestly. There's no way that Isaac can remain alive and also satisfy God. So Abraham has to make a decision. Am I going to satisfy myself or satisfy God? And all along, he's thinking, the only reason I'm going through all this is to satisfy God, to give him this son that I love. Abraham had such faith here that it's almost hard for any of us to understand. The only way that this could possibly happen for Abraham to retain his son and also be obedient to God is if he goes up on the mountain and he kills him and God resurrects his son from the dead, which historically speaking up to this point had never happened before. So Abraham's putting his faith in something that never happened, and yet he believes God's going to do that. We know that because, and you might think, oh, well, is Abraham just giving lip service here? He tells the servants, you guys stay here. The boy and I will go over there, we'll worship God, and we will return to you. So now, is he just saying that? The author of Hebrews says, no, he's not just saying that. In Hebrews 11, it says, Abraham considered that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. He went up on that mountain thinking, Isaac's going to die, and God is going to resurrect him because he said he would. I don't know if I have that kind of faith. I hope that I would if I would ever be in that situation. But that's the situation that Abraham found himself in. It was a dark path to walk for 3 whole days. Yet God was waiting for him at the other side when he came through this trial. We often talk about Abraham here because he's the one that was given the directions. He's the one who has to do things. He's the one who really has to put his faith. Do we ever think, though, about Isaac? Isaac is one where he actually exercises a significant amount of obedience too. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The Bible does refer to him as a young man. Now, what's a young man? A young man could be 5, could a young man be 20? I don't know. if we're speaking relative to Abraham, Abraham is 100 years older than his son. So let's just put a number to it, just to illustrate what I mean. Let's say Isaac is 10 years old. That means Abraham's 110. Do you think it would be easy for a 110-year-old man to bind a 10-year-old boy and to put, when there's fire and all this kind of stuff? It would be hard, okay? So then we think, okay, maybe Isaac is a little older than that, okay, a little more cooperative. We do know that, here's the thing with Isaac, we know that he's obviously at an age where he can speak, he can understand, he knows the idea behind offerings and all that. So whatever age that minimum would put him at. We know that he was under 37 years old. How do we know that? He was 37 when his mother died, when Sarah died. So this was before that. Sarah's still alive. So somewhere between, 7, 10, up to 37. It's a big range, I know. So again, if we say Isaac is 30 years old at this time, which is possible, it would be a little getting on the unlikely side to call a 30-year-old a young man, but again, relative to Abraham, it's possible. But here's the thing, at 30, there's no way that a 130-year-old man can bind a 30-year-old man. So that means that Isaac is being obedient here. Isaac's probably doing the bulk of the work. Abraham gets credit for binding him and taking and all that. That means that Isaac is really a very close representation of Jesus here. He is willing to be a sacrifice for his father, to be obedient for his father. The way that Jesus carried his wooden cross up the mountain, Isaac carried a pile of wood up a mountain to the place of his death. Every single detail we see here is fulfilled in Jesus. And so that's why I tend to think Isaac probably a little more than, at the very minimum, in my mind, I'm thinking he's at least a teenager. He could be in his 20s. For all I know, he could be 30. I don't know. But I think he is at the age where he is exercising obedience to his father in order to be a fulfillment in Jesus. And so it makes me think of several verses actually, but one of the New Testament, or a little portion, is in John 12. Jesus himself said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life." And so what Jesus is saying here is the opposite of what we think. The human perspective is you die, you're dead, it's over, there's nothing more. Jesus says that's not the way it is at all. With God, it is the reverse. When you die, there is only a life to come, because he is the God of life. He loves life. He hates death. And he was asking Abraham here to give up to him the thing or the person that he loved the most, to prove to God that he loved God more than Isaac. To think in your life of all the things that you hold dear to you. Hopefully we'd answer things like children, grandchildren, if you're that age, or parents, grandparents, friends, maybe even reputation, my job, my vocation. For some people, it's even money and power, all those things that we hold. God says, I want you to give it up to me and show me that you love me more than these things. Are you willing to sacrifice those things to me? And so the application here is that the death, when we sacrifice something that is precious to us, something has to take its place. And in the case of Abraham, it was God's blessing. God gave to him that son in return that he did not expect to have, or at least in the way that it happened. God simply saying, I don't want you to love anything more than me. I want you to put me number one. That's what Abraham had to prove to him. And so I came across a brief devotional material that had a really good quote here I'd like to share with you by a man named David Roper. Honestly, I never heard of the man before, but he came up with a good quote here. He says, "It comes to this. Can I endure the loss of anything I deem essential to life and believe that in this place of death and grief, my God will and can provide?" And so, what about us? Do we have that faith that if we give up something to God that we hold dear, that God's going to provide for us in the absence of what we've given to him? And so I'd like to close by sharing something with you. I usually don't read specific quotes this lengthy, but this is something it really struck me as significant. There's a man named Nicholas Wolterstorff. He's still alive. He's 93 years old. He's a former professor of philosophy. He used to work at Yale University, but he's a Christian believer and had been a Christian a long time. He wrote about the loss of his own son. His son died when he was 25 years old in a skiing accident in the mountains over in Europe, I believe. Son's name was Eric. And this is what Nicholas wrote in the wake of the passing of his son. He said, "Never again will anyone inhabit the world the way my son did. Only a hole remains, a void, a gap. My son is gone. The ache of loss sinks down and down, deep beyond all telling. How deep do souls go? I never knew that sorrow could be like this. I do not know why God did not prevent Eric's death. To live without the answer is precarious. It's hard to keep one's footing. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and resurrector of Jesus Christ. I also believe that my son's life was cut off in its prime. I cannot fit these pieces together. I am at a loss. My wound is an unanswered question. Lament and trust are intention." He goes on to explain this as he thinks more about this. He says, "The modern Western practice is to disown one's grief, to get over it, to put it behind one, to get on with life, to put it out of my mind, to ensure that it not become part of one's identity. My struggle was to own it, to make it a part of my identity. If you want to know who I am, you must know that I am one whose son died. If you want to know who God the Father is, you must know he is one whose son died too." In a sense, it is part of the identity of God, a God who loves, a God who suffers, a weeping God who can suffer over my suffering as well. I had thoughtlessly supposed that God loved without suffering. I know that divine love was the key, but I had not realized that the love that is the key is a suffering love. God, at the last minute, prevented the death of Isaac. God intervened for Isaac, but not for his own son. The Father knows the pain of watching his beloved son die on the cross. If you want to know who God the Father is, you must know he is the one whose son died too. This is a puzzling passage of Scripture. But what we can glean from this is just as God has a purpose behind sufferings, even when they come from obedience. Someday in heaven, we will understand the purpose. But until then, if you're suffering today, your suffering will help you to know God. It's a part of the identity of God, a God who loves, a God who suffers, a God who weeps, a God who can suffer over my sufferings as well. Never forget, if you want to know who God the Father is, you must know he is one whose son died too. Couldn't think of a better way to close the message, so let us bow our heads now and go to the Lord in prayer. Almighty God, we thank you for this time together, and by looking at Abraham and Isaac, and looking at even what one other man said, inspired by his own suffering and grief. It just opened up to him a world of knowledge and understanding about who you are. And it's not that you like suffering and death. It's quite the opposite. You hate those things. But God, we go through those things, and you went through the same thing. You can empathize with us. You know what we're feeling when we are going through those valleys in life. And so, God, I pray for anyone here who's in one of those valleys right now. Maybe there's a very difficult time and maybe a difficult road ahead. I also pray for those who are doing well. The Bible tells us that those who are doing well, they should rejoice and they should come alongside those who are suffering. So God, we're thankful in this church that we definitely have both kinds of people here. And that's what makes us get along and draws us closer to each other and draws us closer to you as well. So God, we just ask for your comfort and your blessing on each and every person. As I said, even those who are doing pretty well, having a good week and having a good day. If you give us enough time, God, we know that there's going to be valleys coming. And maybe in those valleys, the people who we have already comforted may come along and comfort us. That's how that works typically. So we just ask for you to be with each and every one of us as we leave this place, shining the light of Jesus Christ and shining the light to you, God. You are the one who lost your son as well. So we thank you and praise you in Jesus' holy name. Amen.